Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Barnett Chedekel was a glass factory owner and a former soldier in the Tsar's army in the Russian Empire. He lived with his wife, Chan, and their three children, Mary, Gershon, and Hyman, in Vilna, Lithuania, which was a part of Tsarist Russia in the early 20th century. In 1909, a pogrom against Jews forced the Chedekel family to flee the country. Jews had lived in this part of Lithuania since the 16th century. The community even built a wooden synagogue there in 1573, shortly before the adjoining street became known as Jews Street. By the turn of the 20th century, Jews were 40% of the city's population, and Vilna was an important center of Jewish culture. There were glassblowers who worked there, glaziers, and many different professions. But with the rise of anti-Semitism and the second-class status that was formally enshrined in Russian law, the family decided to leave. And the Chedekel family became a target of a pogrom, especially because they owned glassworks. Traveling under Chan's maiden name Mirlowitz, a name they kept, the family managed to reach Hamburg, Germany. There, they boarded the Hamburg American Line steamship, the SS President Grant, which was bound for New York City. Once they arrived and were processed through Ellis Island, they lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and in the Bronx until Barnett bought a small farm in a bungalow colony in upstate New York. 2 years after that family arrived, another family arrived from England that was also processed through Ellis Island. Walter Hayter left Purley, England for the United States in 1911. He was 22 years old and thought that he was responsible to help his mother and 12 brothers and sisters. After he arrived in America, he found work on a Michigan farm. In a few months, he was able to send for 3 of his sisters and 1 brother. But all of them became ill during their voyage and recuperated in the contagious disease hospital of Ellis Island. Eventually, the entire Hayter family, except for the oldest son, settled in America. The reason that the siblings were held up in the medical center is because all immigrants that arrived at Ellis Island had to undergo a medical inspection. Officers screened immigrants for physical and mental illness. If they were flagged for illness, they were detained at the hospital complex, and in extreme cases, they were sent back to their home countries. Approximately 3,500 immigrants died at Ellis Island, 1,400 of these being children. But for most patients, like the Hayter sisters, they recovered after treatment and they joined their families in the United States. Now let's look at one more short immigrant story. In December of 1912, Frank Cunha journeyed from Moravia to America, leaving behind his wife Anna, who was pregnant with their second child, and son Jan. Although Cunha wanted to send for his family as quickly as he could, with the onset of World War I in 1914, most European ports were closed down, and they would be until 1919. And the First Quota Act, which curtailed immigration from Eastern Europe, prevented the family from arriving for 10 years. And events like these caused a separation of families that couldn't be processed through Ellis Island. As with the Cunha family, war and other uncontrollable events divided family members between their home country and America. And Frank's method of immigration, in which male members came first and wanted to prepare the way for their family, was a somewhat common way of immigration. They hoped to earn enough money in America so that they could either return to their old country or that they could build up lives for themselves in America and improve their standard of living. And sometimes their families could join them quickly after a matter of weeks or months, but sometimes it would take years. Well, those are 3 short stories of immigration to Ellis Island. This episode, we're going to be looking at Ellis Island itself, why it was built, how it functioned, how people were processed through it, and what are the individual stories of Ellis Island, but also why Ellis Island was built up in the way it was, and what was going on with the wider policy of American immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This episode is based on a question from listener Baron Fraser, who is also a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, and here's how he asks the question. He asked me to do an episode that describes the step-by-step process of going through Ellis Island, why it was a major point of history, and the ebb and flow between eras when we had a nearly open immigration policy, which we did during the period of Ellis Island, where basically anyone who could get on a ship could arrive, and contrast it with eras when immigration restrictionists gained the upper hand. This could be in the mid-19th century with the Know Nothing Party, or it could be in the 20th centuries during World Wars I and II, or it could be in the 20th century in World War II when immigration was heavily restricted and only people from certain countries were really allowed until the 1960s. And of course, the heavily contested political issues today of immigration. Some say that immigration should be mostly abolished and it should be essentially open. Others say that we should have a wall between the United States and Mexico. Something I always try to do on this podcast is take contemporary issues, look at them in the past, and what I almost always find is that it's not as if a political faction of today has a group in the past that mirrors them perfectly, and you can say, oh, I'm on the right side of history today because there were people in the past who did the thing that I'm doing and they were right, or there were people who were doing the opposite of what I'm doing and they were wrong. What typically happens is that there are groups that are a mixture. You can see some of your positions mirrored by one group in the past, but then they do other things that are things you would never want done. What I'm trying to get at is that immigration policy looked very different in the past, and you can't find heroes or villains in the same way, but you can see how the issue is very complicated. But one other big idea that I want to stress before jumping into this episode is that Ellis Island is an example of the changing nature of American power in international affairs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before Ellis Island, immigration was largely left up to states. Different states would have different ports of entry, and different states would decide which immigrant groups they would allow to settle there. This is part of the reason why you see demographics play out in different states, where a lot of Germans go to Texas, for example, a lot of Scandinavians go to Minnesota, Irish people go to New York, for example. Ellis Island is the first step toward a unified federal approach to immigration when America is trying to consolidate its government power. But it's before the period in the 1920s when the United States becomes an international power and has a network of embassies set up in almost every nation on Earth, and immigrants are processed through American embassies abroad and not in the United States itself. So Ellis Island is part of this inflection point, this growth curve of American power, and that's why it's really only as prominent as it is for a few decades in American history. But its legacy lives on in the United States because approximately 100 million people in the United States can trace an ancestor who went directly through Ellis Island at one point and then left behind descendants that still live here to today. So still very important and a part of the national fabric. One last thing I want to mention before we get into Ellis Island. I mentioned that this is broadly a story of immigration to the United States. I'm going to be looking in this episode at the experience of people coming from largely Central and Eastern Europe to the East Coast. And there were about 10 million people or so that came from about a 5-decade period from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, of course, there were people who came from other parts of the world to the United States, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention immigrants from Asia. About 250,000 came from Asia in the same time period, 200,000 of those approximately from China and 50,000 from Japan, mostly to the West Coast, and there are descendants of those immigrant communities there today. Now, that is a different issue, and I think that's worthy of its own episode entirely, and I'll probably do that in the future. So I'm not going to get into that as much, but I just want you to know that I am aware of that, and that is a history that's very important to keep in mind. It's not just about the European immigrant experience, and at some point in the future, I hope to touch on that. Okay. Before we get too much into Ellis Island, we have to take a big step back and look in general the history of the United States. Now, some of America's first settlers came in search of freedom to practice their faith. In 1620, a group of roughly 100 people, later known as the Pilgrims, fled religious persecution in Europe and arrived in Massachusetts at present-day Plymouth. They were soon followed by a larger group seeking religious freedom, the Puritans, who felt marginalized by the Anglicans in England, and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Approximately 20,000 Puritans migrated to the region between 1630 and 1640. Now, there weren't a lot of immigrants who came to the United States at this period because the price of passage was steep to go on sail ship across the Atlantic, and about half or more of the white Europeans who came as indentured servants. Some were kidnapped in European cities and forced into servitude in America, so it wasn't all voluntary. And that's to say nothing of the thousands and later millions who would come to the United States as slaves. Another major wave of immigration occurred from about 1815 to 1865. The majority of these newcomers came from Northern and Western Europe. About a third of these came from Ireland due to the massive famine in the mid-19th century due to potato blight. In the 1840s, almost half of these immigrants were from Ireland alone. These Irish immigrants settled near the point of arrival in the East Coast. And between 1820 and 1930, some 4.5 million Irish immigrated to the United States. Another large immigrant group were from Germany. In the 19th century, some 5 million German immigrants came. Many of them came to the present-day Midwest to buy farms or congregated in cities such as Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. In the census of 2000, more Americans claimed German ancestry than any other group. And the rush of land with the Land Grant Act, where anyone willing to cultivate land for a certain period of time could get their own farmland, was something else that created a massive boon in immigration, especially those from Europe who had an agricultural background, but really didn't have any hope of being able to purchase land of their own. For most of the 1800s, the federal government left immigration policy to individual states. But by the final decades of the century, the government decided it needed to step in to handle the increasing flux of newcomers. One of the first pieces of federal legislation aimed at restricting immigration was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese laborers from coming to America. Californians mostly agitated for the new law because that's where Chinese immigrants were coming, and they blamed them for willing to work less and causing wage depression. But policies changed between 1880 and 1920 due to the change in the flow of immigrants to the United States. Now there were no longer expensive sailing ships like the 1600s, but there were steamships that could travel much more quickly to the United States in the matter of about a week instead of several weeks, and were much safer and much easier to get there. And also, with rapid industrialization in the United States, there were more jobs, and there was a much greater need for unskilled labor. Between 1880 and 1920, America received more than 20 million immigrants. Beginning in the 1890s, the majority of arrivals were from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. Some 600,000 Italians immigrated to America, and by 1920, more than 4 million had entered the United States. Jews from Eastern Europe, fleeing pogroms and religious persecution in Imperial Russia and other places, also arrived in large numbers. Over 2 million entered the U.S. between 1880 and 1920, and large American Jewish centers, such as New York and other places, are formed at this time. Now, the reason that people came to the United States in these times, I already mentioned jobs, finding work opportunities, in other ways weren't so different from the Pilgrims who came 200 years earlier. They were escaping religious persecution and also racial and political persecution. Many were pulled here by contract labor agreements offered by recruiting agents. Hungarians, Slovaks, Bohemians, Italians, and Poles flocked to coal mines or steel mills. Greeks worked in textile mills. Maybe they were from Smyrna in the Ottoman Empire and had worked in this industry at their home. Russian and Polish Jews worked in the needle trades or pushcart markets or were glassblowers in New York. Railroad companies would advertise cheap farmland overseas in pamphlets in many languages to bring agricultural workers to Western farmlands. But the vast majority of immigrants came into growing cities to search for a chance to make a better life for themselves. And like immigrants of today, they came to places where their family already was, or there are already members of their community there. If you were from Italy and didn't speak English, it would make sense to go to Little Italy in New York, where you could at least begin your life with your native language, and as you learn English over time, you can venture wider abroad. And that's the same dynamic in almost any immigrant community in the world today, the way it was in human history as well. And Ellis Island was a very busy place. More than 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island between 1892 and 1954. In 1907, the peak year, over 1 million entered the United States alone. But even though so many people were processed, the process itself of getting into the United States was relatively quickly. For 80% of the people, the process took a few hours and then they were out and through. They would go through a medical inspection, they would ask some questions through our clerk, which I'll talk about later. But unless you were flagged for different reasons, you were in and out. It could take a couple of weeks or a couple of months, or in some very rare cases, a couple of years, but not for most people. Many immigrants remained